My name is Josh Davis, and this is my short story collection presentation on Kurt Vonnegut's Welcome to the Monkey House. Before we dive into the details on the stories, I wanted to give a little bit of information about the author, Kurt Vonnegut. Mr. Vonnegut was born November 11th in 1922. He actually began writing short stories in 1949. Some of his earlier works were actually published in women's magazines and other journalistic type of media. He is a self-taught writer, and in the preface of the book goes on to elaborate on that to say that since he's self-taught, he really doesn't have any type of information to pass on to other writers or anybody who might be interested in becoming a writer. He stated that he wrote the short stories included in the Welcome to the Monkey House to finance the novels that he'd be writing in the future. I also thought it was interesting to note that in the preface, Mr. Vonnegut recalls a story about how he was at a cocktail party and was approached by a pretty girl who asked what he was doing. And his reply was, "I'm committing suicide by cigarette," which I think definitely gives a good example of the darker sense of humor that he has. The collection of Welcome to the Monkey House was published in 1968. Many of the stories that I read in there definitely have similar points of view, and I will be discussing those later on in the presentation. Though the collection may be considered dated, I do find that many of the stories definitely apply to life as we live it today. If Mr. Vonnegut was alive today, I would love the opportunity to sit down and pick his brain to see what he thought of the current state of the world, and to see if perhaps maybe he might change some of the stories that were based in the future to reflect some of the changes that he sees potentially happening. In doing the research for this presentation, I looked around to find out what others had thought about Mr. Vonnegut's stories and his style of writing. Some of the labels that people had attached to Kurt Vonnegut's work were black humor or dark comedy. Some people saw some of his stories as more of a science fiction genre or postmodern. And some people even put the label of frustrated idealist on Mr. Vonnegut. Mr. Vonnegut definitely disliked having his work labeled. He stated that if somebody gives a piece of work a label, it gives the opportunity for the reader to completely disregard certain aspects of that writer's work. So I think what he was meaning by that was that if it was really labeled as one genre or another, somebody might potentially lose out on the opportunity of even reading a great piece of writing just based on the fact that, hey, it's labeled this way, and, I'm not really a fan of that particular genre, so I'm going to pass on it. If I had myself to place a label on Mr. Vonnegut's work, I would definitely have to agree with the frustrated idealist. I do believe that Mr. Vonnegut's life experiences gave him a slightly different point of view of the world, and I think that's definitely what played into having him write more of the darker comical stories. The main connection I see amongst the stories I read, and I did not get a chance to complete the entire collection, but out of the stories I read, I think they all share a common theme of that the world is quickly becoming an overpopulated, boring place to live. And I think that in the examples I'll give later, you will agree with that particular opinion. Mr. Vonnegut had stories that in this collection that dealt with overpopulation of the world. One example of this is actually in the story Welcome to the Monkey House. The narrator in there has a particular quote, and it is, "This was at a time when the population of Earth was 17 billion human beings. This was far too many mammals that big for a planet that small." Again, in another story, Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow, overpopulation is again one of the topics there. In this particular story, the world discovered a medicine in which, if people took it, they could live indefinitely. Lou, one of the characters in there, is out on a balcony talking to his wife, and he says, "Well, you have got to realize the world wouldn't be able to support 12 billion people if it wasn't for processed seaweed and sawdust." Another part of that story is how they were talking about how there's no longer any open space between cities. The world is covered in skyscrapers and cement, and there's no any more grass or anything like that. It's just the world is so congested with people, and that's really the story he paints in that one as well. Another connection I found amongst the stories were that the world was really painted in a very mundane picture. Um, Between the overpopulation and perhaps the laws that were passed, it really made just human beings go through life day to day and just kind of go do the process and rinse and repeat. There wasn't any actual adventure or sense of living. I think this is very apparent in the story Harrison Bergeron. In that particular story, society as a whole, they've come up with ways to handicap people so that everybody is the same. Um, this is done by various ways. So if a person was, say, skinnier than someone else, they would add weight to the skinnier person so that the weight was the same. If you were more beautiful than another human being, you'd be given an ugly mask to wear. And if you were more intelligent than somebody else, you were given a device that would play loud noises in your ear at random times to disrupt your thought process. And that was supposed to symbolize having everybody, everybody was the same. No one would be smarter. No one would be prettier. And they tried to level the playing field for humanity as a whole. In that story, Harrison Bergeron escapes from jail and attempts to free society from being so bland. I think he does it in a bit of a um, bolder sense that he needs to, but he makes an appearance at a ballerina dance off that they're having, and he takes off all his handicaps, and he makes a speech about declaring himself emperor. But after he takes off the handicaps, he says, "Now watch me become what I can become." I think this really symbolizes the fact that, I can do more, and there's more to life than just simply walking through the process and going about your business day in and day out. I think another example of this is in the story "A Welcome to the Monkey House." In this particular story, Billy the Poet is a person who quits taking the government mandated birth control pills, and so he becomes what they refer to in this story as a nothing head. Um, his purpose for doing this is that he goes on a mission to make women see that there can be pleasure in sex. In that particular story, Billy the Poet um, kidnaps Nancy, who is one of the hostesses at a suicide parlor, which is a method that they use for controlling overpopulation in the world. Um, he kidnaps Nancy and makes her quit taking her government mandated birth control, and he rapes her. From this story, you kind of gather that Billy rapes this woman in order to free her, which is kind of weird to say, but as you read on and you kind of see where Billy's coming from, he didn't like to rape women. In fact, he actually hated it, but he did it out of necessity to restore sexual enthusiasm throughout the world. After he takes Nancy's virginity, she begins to understand, and that can be summed up in the line, "It frightened her to understand so easily that from gruesome beginnings, sexual enthusiasm could grow and grow." This presentation is really just a small sample of the stories within that collection. I'm hoping here after finals week that I can finish reading that entire collection, as I did really enjoy the stories that I sampled throughout there. In conclusion here, I do think that perhaps the biggest lesson that Mr. Vonnegut was trying to teach us all was that there can definitely be more to life if we are willing to stand up and go against the norm. This could be anything from being brave enough to follow a dream that seems odd to somebody else, or just making a change in our life, our daily life, to make things better and just to be more fun. Thank you.